The stagecoach, a tired beast caked in the dust of 1,000 weary miles, groaned into Redemption Gulch. It carried more than just bone-weary travelers and forgotten dreams. It carried a secret, a woman hidden beneath a drab bonnet, a truth so potent it would not only shake lonely rancher Ben Carter to his very foundations, but also threaten to unleash a firestorm across the already volatile frontier. Ben waited, a figure of solitude against the sun-bleached boardwalk, bracing for the arrival of the plane, wife he'd ordered. He thought he wanted quiet, unremarkable companionship. What he was about to receive was a spark that could ignite a war, a beauty that defied the prairie's harshness, and a destiny far more dangerous than any outlaw's bullet. The veil was about to lift, and with it, the fragile peace of the entire territory. Ben Carter was a man etched by the land itself. His ranch, a sprawling expanse of hard-won soil and sweat-stained determination, lay like a lonely sentinel at the very edge of Lakota territory. Years had passed since the lung fever had claimed his Martha, and the silence in their sturdy log cabin had since become a constant, heavy companion, a presence more palpable than any ghost. The advertisement for a mail-order bride, discovered in the yellowed pages of an Eastern Gazette, hadn't been an act of romance, but one of stark, frontier pragmatism. He needed a bulwark against the encroaching solitude, a partner to share the relentless burdens of a life wrested from an unforgiving land. His letters, penned in a blunt, unadorned script, had been clear. He sought a woman of resilience, one hard-working and devoid of airs. Comeliness, he'd written, was of no great import. He envisioned a quiet presence, someone to share the meager meals and the long, firelit evenings, not a painted doll to clutter his sparse existence. His own quietude, often mistaken by the boisterous folk of Redemption Gulch for mere shyness, was, in truth, the honed stillness of a seasoned observer. He'd learned long ago that the wind through the prairie grass, the subtle flicker in a man's eye, the unspoken word hanging heavy in the saloon air, these often spoke louder than any shouted declaration. His senses were attuned to the undercurrents, the subtle shifts in the human landscape. And lately, those undercurrents had swirled ominously around Alistair Finch. Finch was a recent arrival, a land agent whose smile was as smooth and false as a gambler's coin, his eyes holding a chill that no desert sun could warm. He'd been acquiring land claims and water rights with an unnerving, almost predatory swiftness, his pockets seemingly bottomless, his methods frequently brushing against the shadowy side of the law. Ben had watched him from afar, marking the insolent swagger of Finch's finely dressed associates, men whose hands hovered a little too close to their holstered iron. Finch moved through Redemption Gulch with an oily confidence, his gaze lingering on things and people that were not his, a calculating hunger in his pale, restless eyes. There were whispers, too, dark rumors that Finch's interest wasn't just in ranch land, but in the sacred bluffs that marked the Lakota boundary, tales of hidden gold and ancient power. Ben filed these observations away, a growing disquiet settling in his gut. All Ben truly yearned for was peace, a life unshackled from the turbulence of his younger, wilder days, a chapter of his life he kept locked tight, buried deep beneath years of relentless toil and self-imposed isolation. Back then, his temper had been a shorter fuse, his draw faster. He'd thought that man long dead and buried. Now, all he asked of fate was a steady hand to share the work, a quiet voice to break the oppressive silence, a presence to make the cabin feel less like a monument to loss and more like a home. He adjusted the brim of his worn Stetson, squinting against the afternoon glare as the stagecoach, with a final sigh of protesting wood and leather, shuddered to a halt, enveloping the street in a momentary shroud of alkali dust. From the coach's dim, stifling interior, a figure emerged. She was small, cloaked head to toe in a heavy, drab material despite the oppressive heat of the late summer day. A deep bonnet, its brim casting her entire face into impenetrable shadow, completed the self-effacing picture. This, then, was her, the woman who had signed her letters simply as Sarah Doe. A peculiar hollowness expanded in Ben's chest, a curious admixture of stoic resignation and a faint, almost foolish flicker of something akin to hope, a hope he'd thought long extinguished. He offered a curt, almost imperceptible nod as she stepped onto the boardwalk, her movements tentative, hesitant, as if she were profoundly unsure of the solid, sun-baked planks beneath her worn boots. She carried a single, battered carpet-bag, its sides scuffed, its clasp tarnished. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, so low he had to strain to hear it, and it was tinged with a soft, unplaceable accent that intrigued him despite himself. Her eyes, lost in the deep shadows of the bonnet, steadfastly avoided his. She seemed more than just plain. She seemed to be actively trying to render herself invisible, to fade into the dusty, sun-bleached backdrop of Redemption Gulch. Ben felt a pang of something that might have been pity, or perhaps just a deeper resignation. This was what he had asked for. Parson Miller, a perpetually flustered man whose palms always seemed to be damp with nervous sweat, was waiting at the small, unadorned clapboard church at the far end of town. The ceremony was to be brief, a simple formality that Ben, in his pragmatic way, wished to conclude with minimal fuss. Inside, the air was dim and stuffy, smelling faintly of dry wood and old hymn books. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of sunlight piercing the grimy window panes. Parson Miller fumbled with the worn pages of his prayer book, his voice quavering slightly as he began the familiar rites. Ben stood stiffly beside the stranger, this Sarah Doe, acutely aware of the faint, unidentifiable scent that clung to her clothes, not perfume, but something earthy, herbal, and strangely wild. It was time. Tradition, even in this rugged outpost, dictated that he lift the bride's veil, a symbolic unveiling before the vows were irrevocably spoken. Ben reached out a calloused, sun-browned hand towards the drab, concealing fabric. As his fingers brushed the material, Sarah flinched. It was a minute, almost imperceptible movement, a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a tensing of her small frame. But Ben, his senses honed by years of solitude and observation, caught it. His hand paused, hovering in the air. What lay hidden beneath that oppressive bonnet? Was it a disfigurement far worse than he had steeled himself to expect? Or was it something else entirely? Something that made her fear even this simple, traditional reveal with such palpable intensity? Before he could act on his resolve, before the veil could be lifted, the church doors, which had been partially ajar, creaked open wider. A brighter, more intrusive shaft of dusty sunlight speared into the dim interior momentarily, blinding them. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon light, stood Alistair Finch. He was flanked, as usual, by two of his most notorious enforcers, Cole and Baxter, their faces hard and impassive, their presence an immediate chill in the warm air. A sneer, ugly and knowing, played on Finch's thin lips as he sauntered into the church, his polished, expensive boots echoing with deliberate insolence on the rough wooden floor. Finch drawled, his voice dripping with a mixture of condescension and oily charm. Carter, didn't imagine you had it in you to finally tie the knot. Though I must confess his eyes, pale and cold, raked over Sarah's cloaked and hidden form with an unpleasant, appraising slowness. I expected well, perhaps something a little more presentable, or at the very least, someone willing to show her face in the house of God. Sarah stiffened so violently it was as if she'd been struck. Her breath caught in a tiny, sharp gasp, a sound so faint that only Ben, standing mere inches from her, could have detected it. A hot, unwelcome wave of irritation, quickly morphing into a deeper anger, washed over Ben. Finch's intrusion felt calculated, a deliberate act of provocation, a violation of this already awkward, deeply personal moment. His jaw tightened, a muscle-pulsing visibility beneath his weathered skin. With a renewed, steely resolve, Ben reached up again. This time, his fingers were firm. He grasped the edge of the bonnet and lifted the veil. The drab fabric fell away, and with it, shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, fell the illusion, a cascade of dark, lustrous hair, the rich, deep color of a raven's wing in moonlight, was loosely bound at the nape of her neck. A few errant tendrils, escaping their confines, curled softly to frame a face of such startling, unexpected, and utterly breathtaking beauty that Ben felt the air forced from his lungs as if by a physical blow. High, sculpted cheekbones, a strong, determined chin that hinted at an unyielding spirit, and eyes. Her eyes, the color of dark, fertile earth after a spring rain, were intelligent, piercing, and fringed by lashes so thick and black they seemed almost unreal. For a fleeting, heart-stopping second, those incredible eyes met his, and in their luminous depths, he saw not timidity or fear, but a fierce spark of defiance, quickly, almost instinctively, veiled by a sudden flicker of apprehension. She was not plain. She was not unremarkable. She was, quite simply, the most astonishingly beautiful woman Ben Carter had ever laid eyes on in his entire, solitary life. A profound, stunned silence descended upon the small church. Parson Miller's jaw hung slack, his prayer book slipping unheeded from his nerveless fingers to land with a soft thud on the dusty floor. Even Alistair Finch's practiced sneer faltered, his pale eyes widening almost imperceptibly for a moment before narrowing again into a predatory glint of raw surprise, swiftly followed by a calculating, avaricious appraisal. Finch murmured a new, covetous tone lacing his voice. "Well now, who, precisely, do we have here, Carter? This is certainly not what your modest reputation would have led one to expect." Sarah's chin lifted a fraction, her gaze, though now deeply troubled, holding a nascent strength that completely belied her earlier display of shrinking timidity. Ben felt a sudden, fiercely protective surge course through him, an ancient, primal instinct he hadn't realized he still possessed, an instinct he thought long buried with his past. He looked from Finch's calculating, leering expression back to the woman beside him, this beautiful stranger who was, by some incredible twist of fate, mere moments away from becoming his wife. The pressing question was no longer just who she was, but why the elaborate, painstaking deception. The day, which had dawned with such simple, pragmatic, and even bleak expectations, had suddenly, irrevocably, become dangerously, electrifyingly complex. The quiet life he craved had just exploded. Life on the ranch with the woman who still insisted on being called Sarah settled into a peculiar rhythm, a surface of quiet domesticity stretched taut over a deep well of unspoken questions and simmering unease. She worked with a tireless, almost desperate energy, her hands, surprisingly calloused beneath their delicate appearance, proving remarkably deft with the demanding, unglamorous chores of a frontier household. She mended his worn shirts with stitches so neat and small they were almost invisible, tended the meager vegetable patch behind the cabin with a knowing, intuitive touch, and moved about their shared space with an economy of movement and quiet efficiency that was entirely at odds with the hesitant, almost clumsy demeanor she had initially presented. Yet, despite their proximity, despite the shared roof and meals, an invisible, almost palpable wall remained stubbornly between them. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice was soft, carefully measured, her words chosen with a caution that hinted at long practice in concealment. Her gaze was often distant, fixed on the hazy, purple-hued bluffs that marked the distant edge of Lakota territory, a brooding, unreadable expression clouding her beautiful features. Ben, a man of few words himself, found her silence profoundly different from his own. His was the quiet of long habit, the stillness of a man who preferred to listen and observe rather than fill the air with needless chatter. Hers, he sensed, was something else entirely, a deliberate construct, a carefully maintained defense against an unseen, unspoken threat. He would often catch her staring towards those distant, sacred bluffs, a flicker of some unidentifiable, powerful emotion. Was it longing, or sorrow, or perhaps even fear? In her dark, expressive eyes before she would quickly look away, her expression shuddering once more, becoming carefully blank. He began to notice other things too, small, seemingly insignificant incongruities that pricked at his heightened awareness, troubling the edges of his mind. There was the way she moved, even when performing the most mundane tasks, with an unconscious, fluid grace, a dancer's poise that she seemed to be actively trying to suppress, to make appear awkward or unsure. He noted the almost unnerving keenness in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she absorbed every detail of her surroundings with an intensity that was far from passive. Once he had seen her tracking a hawk's effortless flight across the vast, empty canvas of the sky, her head tilted, her focus absolute, a look on her face that spoke of a deep, ingrained familiarity with the wild, untamed spaces, a look that no city-bred woman could ever possess. And then there was the small, intricately beaded pouch. He glimpsed it only once, a fleeting sight, when she'd accidentally dropped her worn, dark shawl. It was a thing of exquisite craftsmanship, fashioned from softly tanned hide, and adorned with complex symbols he didn't recognize, but which felt ancient, imbued with a deep, almost spiritual significance. She had snatched it up with a gasp, a rare flush of color rising in her cheeks, and had quickly, almost furtively, tucked it away deep within the modest confines of her worn carpetbag. She never mentioned it, and a deep, instinctive caution, a sense that he was treading on sacred ground, prevented him from asking. One blustery evening, as the wind howled around the eaves of the cabin like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes in their frames, Alistair Finch, accompanied by his two ever-present shadows, Cole and Baxter, rode up to Ben's property line. They didn't dismount, their horses shifting restlessly beneath them, their expressions a mixture of arrogance and thinly veiled menace. Finch called out, his voice carrying easily over the rising shriek of the wind. "Carter, just paying a neighborly visit. Been hearing some interesting talk down in Redemption Gulch. Talk about this northern boundary of yours. Seems there might be some, shall we say, discrepancies in the old survey maps. Discrepancies that might work in my favor." Ben stepped out onto the narrow porch, his stance deliberately relaxed, his hands loose at his sides, but his eyes, narrowed against the sting of the wind-driven dust, were like chips of cold steel. "My claim's clear, Finch. Filed and proper, and you know it." Finch's gaze, however, drifted pointedly past Ben, towards the cabin door where Sarah stood, a slender silhouette in the rapidly fading light. His eyes lingered on her, a slow, insolent, and possessive inventory that made Ben's blood begin to simmer with a slow, dangerous heat. A man with a new and unexpectedly comely wife needs to be absolutely certain his holdings are secure. Wouldn't you agree, Carter? Finch's smile was thin, reptilian, predatory. Wouldn't want any unfortunate misunderstandings to arise, especially not when there's so much at stake. Ben felt that protective surge again, sharper this time, more urgent. He shifted his position slightly, a subtle, almost unconscious movement, yet one that effectively placed him more fully between Finch and the doorway where Sarah stood. "There are no misunderstandings, Finch," he stated, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is my land, and she is my wife." Sarah's reaction to Finch's presence, and particularly to his words, was immediate and intense. Ben saw her breath hitch, saw her body go rigid as if braced for a blow. Her hand, hidden in the folds of her simple skirt, instinctively, almost convulsively, went to her side, to where Ben now knew she kept that mysterious beaded pouch. Her eyes, fixed on Finch with an unblinking stare, held a volatile mixture of cold, unadulterated fury and something else, something that looked chillingly like recognition. Did she know this man from before? The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through Ben. Finch merely chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound that the wind seemed to snatch away and mock. "We'll see about that, Carter. We'll see about everything." With a curt, dismissive nod to his men, he wheeled his horse sharply and rode off into the gathering gloom, Cole and Baxter falling in behind him like obedient, malevolent hounds. Later that week, the disquiet Ben felt deepened into genuine alarm. He was out checking his fences along the winding creek that formed the natural boundary with the Lakota lands. Tucked beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient cottonwood, almost invisible in the tall, whispering prairie grass, he found a single, strikingly beautiful feather. It was long and slender, a deep, glossy black, tipped with a vibrant, startling crimson. It was unlike any feather from any local bird he knew. It looked intentional, as if it had been deliberately placed there, or perhaps lost by someone who had no business being on his land. He picked it up, turning it over in his calloused fingers, a strange, cold premonition prickling the back of his neck. Back at the cabin, he showed it to Sarah, holding it out on his open palm. "Ever seen a feather like this around these parts?" She looked at it, her face a careful, impenetrable mask. Her eyes, however, widened almost imperceptibly for a fraction of a second before her expression smoothed. "No," she said, her voice quiet, almost too quiet. "It is unusual." But her denial felt hollow. Practiced. Her eyes darted away from the feather, from his searching gaze, far too quickly. He saw her hand clench briefly at her side, her knuckles white, before she forced it to relax. The quiet rancher, the man who had sought only a plain and simple life, a respite from the ghosts of his past, was beginning to suspect, with a certainty that grew heavier by the day, that his beautiful, enigmatic wife was entangled in something far deeper, far more complex, and infinitely more dangerous than a mere mail-order marriage. The peace he craved was receding like a cruel mirage in the desert heat, replaced by the ominous, gathering clouds of an approaching storm, a storm of questions, of hidden identities, and of a growing, pervasive sense of unease. His observations were no longer casual or passive. They were focused now, intense, searching for the elusive truth that she so carefully, so desperately concealed. He had to know, and he sensed, with a chilling certainty, that knowing would change everything. Finch's insidious pressure began to mount, insidiously at first, like a slow-acting poison, then with an increasing, arrogant boldness. One morning, Ben discovered a 50-foot section of his newly mended fence near the northern pasture deliberately cut, the heavy-gauge wire snipped clean through in multiple places. His cattle, prime breeding stock, had wandered off towards the rough country bordering the Lakota lands. It took him 2 hard days to round them up. A few days later, his prize bull, a magnificent Hereford he'd paid a small fortune for, an animal crucial to his ranch's future, vanished without a trace. Ben searched for days, his frustration coiling into a cold, hard knot of anger in his stomach. He rode countless miles, his eyes scanning every gully, every stand of cottonwood, but found nothing. No tracks, no sign. It was as if the earth had swallowed the animal whole. He knew, with a bone-deep certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that Alistair Finch was behind these calculated acts of sabotage. The man was systematically trying to dismantle his livelihood, trying to drive him off his land that, Ben was increasingly aware, held a particular strategic importance due to its proximity to those brooding Lakota bluffs and the hidden, sacred valley rumored to lie beyond them. Whispers had long persisted in Redemption Gulch, furtive tales told in hushed tones in the smoky corners of the saloon, of gold, vast quantities of it, hidden somewhere deep within those hills, a treasure guarded by the Lakota for generations. Though no white man had ever found definitive proof, the legend endured, fueling the avarice of men like Finch. Finch, it was becoming terrifyingly clear, not only believed the rumors, but coveted that sacred land with a desperate, all-consuming hunger. The townsfolk of Redemption Gulch, already deeply wary of Finch and his band of hired muscle, offered Ben sympathetic murmurs and averted gazes, but little in the way of concrete support. They had their own small spreads to worry about, their own families to protect from Finch's encroaching influence. Fear was a potent currency, and Finch wielded it with ruthless skill. Ben understood their reticence, their need for self-preservation, but it left him feeling increasingly isolated, a lone figure standing against a rising, malevolent tide. He tried on several occasions, during the quiet, firelit evenings, to gently, carefully, question Sarah about her past, about the compelling reasons that would drive a woman of her obvious breeding and extraordinary beauty to answer the humble advertisement of a lonely, isolated rancher in the untamed wilderness. "Why did you truly come west, Sarah?" he'd asked one night, his voice soft, as they sat by the crackling fire, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. "What, or who, were you leaving behind?" She would always become skillfully evasive, her dark eyes clouding over with a silent, almost desperate plea that he couldn't decipher, a plea that nonetheless stayed his tongue. "I sought a new life," she would murmur, her gaze dropping to her hands, which would invariably be busy with some mending task. A chance to start over. Her answers were always vague, always unsatisfying, effectively ending the conversation. Her walls, he was discovering, were formidable, built of secrets and shadows. He found himself watching her more intently than ever, cataloging every nuance of her behavior. He noted the almost preternatural way her ears would prick at the sound of distant riders, long before his own experienced senses registered their approach. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible tension that would stiffen her shoulders, the way her breath would catch whenever Finch's name was mentioned in town, or when his riders passed too close to the ranch. There was a constant, underlying watchfulness about her, a coiled readiness that was utterly at odds with her quiet, almost subservient demeanor in his presence. She was like a finely tuned instrument, vibrating with an unseen tension. One afternoon, Ben informed Sarah that he needed to ride out to check a distant line cabin, a small, isolated structure on the far western edge of his property. It was a task that would keep him away overnight. A storm was brewing, he told her, gesturing towards the bruised, purple clouds massing on the horizon. He meant the weather, but the words held a double meaning that hung heavy in the air between them. He left her with ample provisions and a stern reminder to keep the cabin door barred and the rifle loaded. He rode away with a knot of unnamed anxiety tightening in his chest, a feeling that he was leaving her exposed to a danger he couldn't yet name, but felt with every fiber of his being. He returned late the next day, weary, mud-spattered, and chilled to the bone. The storm had broken with a vengeance, turning the prairie into a quagmire. As he neared the ranch, the knot of anxiety he'd carried with him tightened into a cold dread. The cabin was unnervingly quiet, too quiet. "Sarah," he called out, his voice hoarse, pushing open the heavy plank door. The main room was empty. Her shawl, the one she always wore, lay draped neatly over the back of her rocking chair. A pot of stew, now cold and congealed, sat on the hearth. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, gripped him. He searched the small cabin, then the barn, his calls of her name echoing unanswered, swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. Then, near the back of the barn, half hidden beneath a pile of discarded burlap sacks, he found it. A dress. It was a cheap, faded calico, not Sarah's usual somber, well-mended attire. It looked like something worn for disguise, or perhaps discarded in extreme haste. A frantic, desperate energy surged through him, overriding his weariness. Where would she go? Why? His eyes were drawn inevitably, irresistibly, towards the Lakota bluffs, brooding and purple in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist. Had Finch finally made his move? Had he taken her? Or had she fled from him? From something else entirely? The questions tore at him. He saddled his freshest horse, his movements quick, economical, his mind racing. He had to find her. The tracks leading away from the ranch were faint, almost invisible to an untrained eye, nearly obliterated by the recent storm. But Ben Carter's past, the one he kept so carefully locked away, had taught him things. Many things. He knew how to read the land, how to decipher its subtle, silent language. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the storm-cleansed clouds in hues of bruised orange and deep violet, he rounded a high, rocky outcrop that overlooked a secluded, narrow canyon, a place few knew existed. And there, in the fading light, he saw her. She was not a captive. She was not cowering in fear. She was not alone. Sarah no, this woman, standing tall and proud in the heart of the canyon, was not the Sarah he knew, not the timid, veiled creature who had arrived on the stagecoach, stood in earnest conversation with a tall, powerfully built Lakota warrior. The warrior was magnificent, adorned with eagle feathers that stirred in the evening breeze, his buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork. He carried a long, feathered lance and a painted shield. They spoke together in fluent Lakota, a language Ben only vaguely understood from years of proximity to their lands, but the tone of their exchange was unmistakable. Her posture was no longer hesitant or subdued. It was regal, commanding, imbued with an innate authority that stunned him to the core. Her voice, though he couldn't grasp the individual words, was clear and resonant, filled with a quiet power that compelled absolute attention. The warrior listened with an almost reverent focus, his head bowed slightly, an expression of profound respect etched on his stern, weathered face. Ben watched hidden amongst the rocks, his heart pounding against his ribs, as Sarah, no, this unknown woman, handed the warrior the small, beaded pouch he had glimpsed before. The warrior accepted it with a gesture of deep reverence, touching it briefly to his forehead before tucking it securely into his belt. Ben's world tilted on its axis, the familiar landscape of his life shifting into something strange and unrecognizable. The quiet, seemingly plain mail-order bride, the woman who flinched at his touch and spoke in frightened whispers, was a phantom, a carefully constructed illusion. This woman, standing proud and fearless in the very heart of Lakota land, conversing with a formidable warrior as an equal, perhaps even as a superior, who was she? The disparate pieces of the puzzle, her inexplicable beauty that she couldn't quite hide, her instinctive knowledge of the wild, her profound, visceral fear of Finch, her intense, almost spiritual connection to this land, all clicked into place with a jarring, breathtaking clarity. He had married a lie, a deception of incredible depth and daring, but the truth, he was beginning to suspect with a sense of awe, was far more compelling, far more astonishing, and infinitely more dangerous than he could ever have conceived. Ben didn't charge down into the canyon like a fool. He waited, his heart a cold, heavy knot in his chest, every nerve thrumming, until the Lakota warrior departed, melting back into the deepening twilight shadows of the bluffs as if he were a spirit of the land itself. Only then, when she was truly alone, did Ben make his presence known, guiding his horse slowly, deliberately, down the narrow, treacherous trail into the canyon. She turned at the sound of his horse's hooves on the loose rock, her eyes widening first in surprise, then in a dawning, palpable apprehension. The regal, commanding bearing she had displayed moments before faltered for a brief instant, replaced by a flicker of the vulnerability that reminded him so strongly of the Sarah he thought he knew. But it was fleeting. She stood her ground, her chin lifting defiantly, her expression unreadable in the rapidly fading light. "Ben," she said, her voice no longer the hesitant, breathy whisper he was accustomed to, but the clear, resonant tone he had just overheard. There was no point in pretense now. The charade was over. "You have some explaining to do, I reckon," Ben said, his own voice rougher, more strained than he intended. He dismounted, standing before her, the immense weight of her deception, of her secrets, hanging heavy and unspoken in the charged air between them. Cornered, with the undeniable evidence of her true identity laid bare before him, her carefully constructed facade finally, irrevocably, crumbled. She looked at him, a long, searching gaze, as if trying to read his soul, to gauge his reaction, his capacity for understanding, for forgiveness. Then, as the last light of day bled from the sky, she began to speak, and the story that unfolded was more extraordinary, more perilous, than any tale he had ever heard told around a lonely campfire, under a canopy of indifferent stars. Her true name, she told him, her voice now infused with a quiet pride, was Wíyaka Lúta, Scarlet Feather. But among her people, the Secanga Lakota, she was also known and revered as Tenjiangyahi, Morning Star, a name whispered with hope and reverence, for she was the only daughter of their ailing chief, a princess of her tribe, the carrier of their traditions, the hope for their future. Alistair Finch, she explained, her voice hardening, laced with a cold, righteous anger that resonated deep within Ben, was far more than just a common, greedy land grabber. Years ago, long before he had arrived in Redemption Gulch, Finch had operated under the guise of a friendly trader, insinuating himself into the trust of some of the outlying Lakota bands. He had learned their ways, their weaknesses, and then, with devastating cruelty, he had betrayed them. He had led a band of ruthless, well-armed men in a brutal, unprovoked raid, seeking not just plunder, but a sacred ancestral artifact, the Ptoy8 Wowings, the heartstone of the mountain, an object of immense spiritual power, hidden deep within their most sacred, secret lands. The heartstone was not merely valuable in terms of gold or jewels. It was the spiritual center of her people, its protection a sacred duty passed down through her bloodline for countless generations. Finch, she continued, his initial attempt thwarted, had become pathologically obsessed with finding it, believing it held untold magical power or, at the very least, would lead him to a legendary, lost gold mine of unimaginable wealth. He had recently, through treachery and spies, discovered Morning Star's true identity and her profound connection to the artifact, realizing she was the key. He tried to coerce her, had even attempted to force a marriage alliance, a perverse union that would grant him, he believed, legitimate access to the tribe's secrets and their sacred territory. Her ugliness, the carefully crafted persona of the plain and unremarkable Sarah Doe, had been a desperate, last-ditch disguise, a complex ruse involving carefully applied herbal stains to dull her vibrant complexion and darken her lustrous hair, and a practiced, soul-crushing submissiveness in her every mannerism, to escape Finch's ever-watchful spies and the escalating, deadly threat to herself and, through her, to her people. She had answered Ben's humble advertisement for a mail-order bride as a final, desperate gamble, a leap of faith into the unknown. His ranch, situated as it was on the very edge of her people's ancestral territory, offered a potential, albeit precarious, sanctuary. More importantly, it offered a strategic vantage point from which she could observe Finch's movements, gather information on his plans, and perhaps, just perhaps, find a way to protect the Heartstone and warn her tribe of Finch's renewed, more dangerous efforts. The persona of a plain, quiet, unremarkable wife had seemed the perfect, impenetrable cover. The church ceremony, the obscuring veil, it was all meant to be a swift, unnoticed transition into a protective anonymity. "The day we were to be married in the church," she said, her voice low, trembling slightly with the memory, when Finch walked in. "I thought he knew then. I was certain he'd seen through my disguise, that my gamble had failed. When you reached for the veil, I was terrified. And then, when you lifted it, I saw the look in his eyes. He didn't recognize me as Morning Star, not then, not immediately, but he saw something else, something new to covet. It made him, I knew, even more dangerous, more unpredictable." Ben listened, stunned into a profound silence. It was not primarily by her revealed beauty, which was now, as she spoke with the passion and conviction of her true self, utterly radiant, almost otherworldly in the twilight. It was by the immense, crushing weight of her burden, the sheer, breathtaking courage of her desperate, dangerous deception, and the terrible, imminent peril she had willingly, knowingly walked into. He thought of the plain, simple woman he had expected, the quiet, uncomplicated life he had so desperately craved. He had received neither. Instead, fate had delivered into his hands a warrior princess, a woman engaged in a silent, desperate, high-stakes war for the very survival of her heritage. The image from the thumbnail idea, the one he'd only vaguely imagined, now flashed through his mind with vivid, startling clarity. The unsuspecting cowboy lifting the veil, the stunning, proud Lakota woman revealed, his own face a mask of utter shock. That single, pivotal moment in the dim, dusty church had been the first, tiny crack in her elaborate disguise, a fateful prelude to this full, breathtaking, life-altering revelation here, under the vast, indifferent canvas of the western sky. He looked at Morning Star, truly seeing her for the very first time, not as Sarah, the timid mail-order bride, but as Wíyaka Lúta, a woman of extraordinary, almost unimaginable courage, fighting a lonely battle for everything she held sacred. His own lifelong desire for a simple, peaceful life suddenly seemed a small, petty, almost selfish thing in the face of her monumental struggle. Finch wants the Heartstone, she continued, her dark eyes pleading with him, urging him to understand the enormity of the threat. He believes it's hidden in the valley beyond those bluffs, the valley you saw me in. He will stop at nothing, Ben. Nothing. He's been systematically trying to force your neighbors off their land, trying to isolate your ranch completely, because it provides him with the easiest, most direct access to our sacred ground. Ben's jaw tightened until it ached. The cut fences, the stolen bull, Finch's insinuations about his property lines. It hadn't been random aggression or simple land grabbing. It had all been strategic, cold, and calculated. He thinks I'm just another obstacle in his path. And now, Morning Star said, her voice heavy with a new layer of concern, he knows you have a wife who is not what she seemed to be. He will be even more suspicious, more relentless, more dangerous than before. He will not rest until he has what he wants. A new, unfamiliar resolve, cold and hard as forged steel, solidified in Ben's gaze. He was no longer just a lonely rancher seeking solace and companionship. He was a man whose life, by a twist of fate he could never have foreseen, had become inextricably, irrevocably entwined with the Lakota princess and her sacred, perilous duty. The quiet observer in him, the man who had meticulously noted Finch's avarice and cruelty from afar, now receded. In his place, the part of him he'd tried for so long to bury, the part that knew the harsh realities of survival, the part that knew how to fight, began to stir, to reawaken from its long slumber. Then we don't wait for him to make the next move, Ben said, his voice firm, resonant with a conviction that surprised even himself. We make ours. We take the fight to him. Morning Star looked at him then, truly looked at him, and in her dark, expressive eyes, he saw a flicker of profound surprise, quickly followed by a wave of deep, overwhelming gratitude that needed no words. The invisible wall between them, the one built of deception and secrets and unspoken fears, had finally, completely crumbled. In its place stood a shared purpose, a bond forged in danger and truth, as vast and formidable and resilient as the frontier itself. Knowing the full, astonishing truth, Ben Carter felt a forgotten, deeply buried part of himself reawaken, stretching like a hibernating bear roused too soon. The quiet, unassuming rancher, the man most in Redemption Gulch dismissed as a reclusive widower, possessed layers of experience and skill that few, if any, suspected. He was a man who had once been a highly regarded scout for the Army, years ago, navigating this very wilderness, before disillusionment with their methods and a yearning for peace had driven him to seek solace in the solitude of his ranch. Those skills, long dormant and used for years, now surged to the surface, sharp and ready. He and Wíyaka Lúta, Morning Star, began to plan, their minds working in concert, two disparate souls united by a common enemy and a desperate cause. She sent word to her tribe through trusted, secret channels, swift, silent runners disappearing into the vastness of the night like whispers on the wind, carrying urgent messages of Finch's renewed determination, his dangerous proximity, and the escalating threat he posed not just to the sacred Heartstone, but to the fragile, tenuous peace of the entire region. Meanwhile, Ben, drawing on his old tracking abilities and a carefully cultivated network of old contacts from his scouting days, men who owed him favors, men who, like him, had seen the darker, more brutal side of westward expansion and harbored no love for men like Finch, began to gather his own intelligence. He rode through the territory, no longer as a simple homesteader checking his fences, but as the keen-eyed scout he once was, his eyes sharp, his movements economical and cautious. He unearthed damning evidence of Finch's illegal land grabs, meticulously documented coerced testimonies from intimidated settlers who had lost their claims under duress, and gathered undeniable proof of his brutal, strong-arm tactics against anyone, settler or native, who dared to stand in his way. The confrontation they meticulously planned was not to be a desperate, dusty street shootout, though Ben kept his Colt Peacemaker well-oiled and readily accessible at his hip. Instead, they aimed for something far more decisive, something that would not just stop Finch, but utterly break his power and influence in Redemption Gulch for good. The opportunity they sought presented itself when Finch, arrogant and dangerously overconfident in his control over the town, called a public town meeting. He announced, to discuss progress and development in the region, a thinly veiled, self-serving attempt to solidify his control, intimidate any remaining opposition, and perhaps even propose some new, exploitative venture involving the lands near the Lakota territory. He expected a cowed, compliant populace, ready to bend to his iron will. He certainly did not expect Ben Carter and his supposedly plain wife to be the architects of a spectacular undoing. On the appointed day of the meeting, the town's small, clapboard meeting hall was crowded, the air thick with unspoken tension and apprehension. Finch stood at the front, puffed up with self-importance, flanked by the ever-present Cole and Baxter, and at least a half-dozen other hard-faced, tight-lipped men he employed as security. He was pontificating in his smooth, persuasive voice about prosperity and order, painting himself as the town's benefactor. Then, the main door of the hall creaked open, and Ben Carter walked in. His expression was calm, his gaze steady. Beside him, no longer garbed in drab, concealing calico, but in a finely tanned, beautifully adorned doeskin dress that shimmered with intricate quillwork, her lustrous dark hair flowing freely, unconfined, stood Morning Star. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the assembled townsfolk. This was not the timid, veiled woman they had glimpsed briefly at the church. This was a woman of undeniable presence, of breathtaking beauty, and of an almost palpable power. "Mr. Finch," Ben said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the suddenly, completely silent hall. "We have a few things we'd like to add to your discussion of progress." Finch's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits, his practiced smile tightening into a vicious snarl. "Carter, and your wife, I presume?" he sneered. "Quite the transformation. I hardly recognized her." "My name," she declared, her voice ringing out, clear and strong, imbued with an innate authority that commanded absolute attention, "is Wíyaka Lúta, Morning Star of the Secanga Lakota. And this man, Alistair Finch, is no benefactor to this community. He is a liar, a thief, and a desecrator of sacred trusts." She then turned and addressed the stunned townsfolk directly, not as a mail-order bride, but as a Lakota princess, a leader of her people. She spoke with fiery eloquence of Finch's long history of treachery against her tribe, his relentless, obsessive pursuit of their sacred lands and the Heartstone, his pattern of violence and deceit that stretched back years, leaving a trail of broken promises and spilled blood. She spoke of his more recent attempts to intimidate and defraud the settlers of Redemption Gulch, his tactics of pitting neighbor against neighbor, all for his own selfish, insatiable gain. Her words were impassioned, infused with righteous anger, and undeniably, chillingly true. As she finished, a hush fell over the hall, broken only by Finch's strangled sputtering. Ben stepped forward, methodically laying out the irrefutable evidence he had painstakingly gathered. Signed affidavits from dispossessed settlers, surveyors' maps clearly showing Finch's fraudulent land claims, notarized testimonies detailing his campaign of intimidation and violence. The mood in the hall shifted dramatically, fear transmuting into a simmering, righteous anger. Faces that had been pale with apprehension now hardened with resolve. Men who had previously avoided Ben's gaze, who had offered only whispered sympathies, now met his eyes with dawning understanding, with respect, and with a newfound, shared determination. Finch, his face contorted with a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, saw his carefully constructed empire of fear and intimidation crumbling before his very eyes. Lies. All lies. He roared, his voice cracking. These are savages and a washed-up, has-been farmer trying to stir up trouble. Cole. Baxter. Seize them. Do it now. His hired guns, momentarily shaken but still loyal to their paymaster, moved forward, their hands instinctively reaching for their holstered weapons. But before they could take more than 2 hesitant steps, the doors and windows of the meeting hall were suddenly, silently, filled with the stern, painted faces of Lakota warriors, armed with rifles and bows, their expressions resolute and formidable. They had been hidden, strategically positioned, waiting patiently for Morning Star's signal. Simultaneously, within the hall itself, several of the townsmen, those who had suffered most acutely under Finch's oppressive reign, stood up as one, their own weapons, shotguns, hunting rifles, pistols, appearing as if by magic from beneath coats and benches. The balance of power in Redemption Gulch had irrevocably, dramatically, shifted. Finch's hired guns froze in their tracks, their bravado evaporating like mist in the morning sun in the face of such overwhelming, unexpected, and unified opposition. Finch himself looked wildly around, his eyes darting from the stoic warriors to the determined townsfolk, trapped, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning terror. His gaze finally fell on Morning Star, and in his eyes, Ben saw not just hatred, but the dawning, terrible, soul-crushing realization of his complete and utter defeat. "You won't get away with this!" Finch shrieked, his voice high-pitched and shrill, backing away clumsily. He made a desperate, last-ditch lunge for a side door, but a towering Lakota warrior, materializing as if from the very shadows, blocked his path, an immovable force, as stoic and unyielding as stone. Justice, swift and of the frontier variety, was served. Finch and his key enforcers were quickly disarmed and securely bound. The insidious threat they had posed to Redemption Gulch and the Lakota lands was neutralized, their reign of intimidation and greed decisively, publicly ended. The heartstone of the mountain remained safe, its sacred location still a closely guarded secret, known only to Morning Stars. People. The townsfolk, liberated from Finch's suffocating shadow, found anew profound respect for their Lakota neighbors and for the quiet, unassuming rancher and his truly extraordinary wife. In the aftermath, Alistair Finch and his closest associates faced the stern judgment of a territorial magistrate, their manifold crimes laid bare for all to see, their sentences long and harsh. Redemption Gulch began to breathe easier. The oppressive weight of Finch's greed and menace finally lifted from their shoulders. A cautious but genuine dialogue, a fragile new beginning, started between the settlers and the Lakota, brokered by the hard-won mutual respect forged in shared adversity between Ben Carter and Princess Morning Star. The ugly bride, the woman who had arrived under a veil of desperate deception, had, in the end, brought a beautiful, healing, and transformative truth to light. Ben and Morning Star stood together on the porch of a small cabin, watching the sun dip below the western horizon, painting the vast, evening sky in breathtaking shades of fire and amethyst. Their marriage, a union born of her desperate necessity and his lonely pragmatism, had been unexpectedly, miraculously, transformed by shared adversity, by acts of incredible courage, and by a growing, undeniable, and deeply resonant affection. She had her sacred duties to her people, a profound responsibility she could, and would, never abandon. He had his ranch, the life he had painstakingly, solitarily built from the stubborn earth. The future was unwritten, their path forward together uncertain, a trail yet to be blazed. "My people will always need me," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the distant, purple-hued bluffs where the Heartstone lay hidden and safe, a silent, eternal sentinel. "And this ranch," Ben replied, his calloused hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of quiet strength and belonging, "is a powerful, lonely place, without you in it. She turned to him then, a gentle, knowing smile gracing her lips, her dark, luminous eyes reflecting the deep, rich colors of the twilight sky. "Perhaps," she said, her voice filled with a quiet hope, "a bridge can be built between two peoples, between two hearts." Then looked at the remarkable woman beside him, princess, warrior, wife. He had sought a plain, unremarkable companion to ease the ache of his solitude. Instead, fate, in its inscrutable wisdom, had given him a partner who challenged him, who inspired him, who had reawakened the dormant hero within him, and who had shown him the true, profound meaning of courage, of connection, of love. The peace he had craved for so long, he now understood, wasn't a mere absence of conflict, but the quiet strength, the unwavering resilience, found in facing life's storms together. The dust of the trail had settled for now, leaving behind a hard-won understanding, a fragile but enduring hope, and the promise of a new, shared beginning, a testament to the unexpected, breathtaking beauty that can blossom even in the harshest, most unforgiving of frontiers. His ugly bride had unveiled not just her face, but a future richer, deeper, and more profoundly meaningful than he could ever have dared to hope for.